Previously on Impious. Also must say that this stage of development was too crucial to stop and make videos. But now I want to get back into it more regularly. Well, it's been like 5 months since that video. But I actually been working really hard on some new mechanics and focusing on what it's called FTUE. That stands for the first time user experience, you know, the very players first contact with the game. One of those things people sometimes overlook, but it's extremely important. Why did I focus on this right now? The fact is that I followed the golden rule of a test early, so I did. And it didn't went that cool because not because it was a disaster at all, but there was some problems regarding. And I realized that most of the people didn't understood many of the mechanics and the things in the game. The first person who tried the game hasn't played the games in years, but didn't know how to rotate the camera or move the character. And first reaction is natural, like, hey, wait. Seriously, you don't know how to move the character with WSD and rotate the camera with the mouse? Okay. And then I went to a local game dev event in my town to get some feedback from other devs, and started to realize that not everything was that obvious after all. You know, I had to explain everything one by one to everyone, and that's wrong. You know, and the next day I just made some remote testings with other devs and had the same issues. So, totally confirmed, it was my fault.
¿Qué coño es lo de observador?
Los puntos de acción son eso.
Ah, estos son los puntos de acción.
Claro, tío. Se te rolean de momento 4 al principio de cada turno. Puedes ponerte 2 arriba y descartar los que quieras.
A ver, cuando tú lo pones arriba, ¿lo estás descartando o lo estás usando en esa ronda? Ah, vale.
Aquí no queda muy claro, o sea, si tengo que cliquear aquí, o sea, ahora entiendo que tengo que cliquear simplemente en el centro, pero como esto está así, digo, como que de primeras dices, si cliqueo aquí es como que elijo esta opción y aquí esta, pero no es eso. ¿Qué cojones es esto? Esto no me queda claro. Observer. Ni puta idea qué hace.
The fuck is this asshole? What's this? So I have to keep it in this range, right? Or I get enemies. Is that the idea?
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah, but how do I attack?
I won't tell you. It's pretty obvious. For me.
Really? It's not for me, actually. So. Oh. Yeah. Obviously. Yeah, you could probably make a tutorial out of like first mission or something.
Yeah. So yeah, besides the whatever gameplay feedback I got, I realized that everybody hit the same wall, had the same problems with some stuff that I considered obvious, and it's not. Here's the thing. If the player doesn't understand the game at the first glance, there's a risk that the feedback loses value, because they don't take this seriously, and it starts to be something like I'm going to click everything until something works, I don't know. Bear in mind that this is absolutely normal. You're working on your project several hours a day, you're running it for hundreds of times a day. You designed every button, so it's so normal to lose the perspective on it. Everything makes sense for you, but it doesn't mean that makes sense for other people. So I pulled the handbrake and started to think about how to make a kind of a in-game tutorial. It should be a tutorial that is interactive and it doesn't collide at all with the code base, and that forced me to finish all the mechanics I had on hold and present those mechanics in an ordered way. So let me show you what I did. So how did I actually approach this? To make sure the tutorial wasn't invasive, I needed it to live in a separate scene, a unique one that could receive signals and override the rest of the game systems without interfering with the core mechanics. That way, I wouldn't have to spread the tutorial logic across a bunch of different scripts and nodes. This tutorial scene contains all the usual stuff, like arrows, text boxes, helper overlays, everything needed to guide the player through each step. And thanks to the event bus system and the twinner I had already set up earlier, wiring up the signals was actually fairly easy. But what really became a pain was preventing the player from breaking the tutorial or getting stuck in it. Like, let's say the tutorial is waiting for the player to pick up an item, but instead of doing that, they close the inventory, walk into another room, or just do something unexpected. Boom! The tutorial flow breaks, or worse, it crashes, whatever. That turned into an about 1500 line script, handling signals, checking states, hiding and showing UI depending on the situation, enabling and disabling buttons, locking inputs, positioning arrows to elements in the world or the interface, basically doing everything I could to stop the player from breaking the tutorial. It is a massive task, and honestly, one of those things that needs to be tested a ridiculous number of times, step by step, just to make sure the player doesn't break it in some unexpected way. Once the system was stable, the next step was to design a tutorial flow that made sense. What to show first, what to leave for later, in a way that would guide the player without fully taking control away from them. After spending quite some time figuring out what made the most sense, I ended up with a structure that felt right for the current version of the game, with around 11 general steps that go something like this. We start with the basic movement, easy. The tutorial waits for the player to press some movement keys, rotate the camera, and once those inputs are registered, we move on. From there, we go straight into the crafting system. The character starts the tutorial with low health points from a supposed previous run, but also with some items already in his inventory. The main idea here is to teach the player how to craft a healing item and recover some health from it. The crafting system itself is intentionally simple. When you find a new item that is part of a recipe, you automatically learn the recipe, and you can also experiment by combining items through trial and error. So we place the item in the input bag, the system recognizes the recipe, we craft the item, and then we go ahead and use it. Next, we introduce the status orb and go over what those values actually mean and how they are connected to the player. Then we move on to the stash, showing the player that they can store items between runs and access them later. We also explain how to equip gear and how it affects the player stats, giving a quick overview of attributes and status effects. After that, we introduce the room system, how you move between rooms, how the outcome is changed based, and how to read the wheel to understand what kind of room might be coming next. In the tutorial, of course, the result is forced, so we land in a rain room for demonstration purposes. Now I need to pause here and explain a refactor I had to do. Originally, when you clicked on something that is interactable, I spawned some in-world wheels to represent your options. It looked cool, very atmospheric even, but it had a big flaw. Another fellow dev, someone who works mostly in UX and client-facing design, tested the game and pointed out that I was hiding too much information behind tooltips. And yeah, he was right. I had a fairly advanced tooltip system at that point, and I was relying so much on it to display almost everything. But a tooltip should only be used for secondary information, not the core data the player needs to make decisions. In this case, you had to put the mouse over icons to check the chances, the percentages, and outcomes and consequences. And that's wrong. Even more if you take in consideration that the working memory of the human brain can only hold like 4 chunks of information at once. So expecting someone to remember all the possible outcomes tied to each action just by hovering around, it's a UX nightmare, is not correct. So I had to refactor the whole system. Instead of showing options through in-world wheels and hiding all the details in tooltips, I redesigned everything to show all the information up front. Now there are panels clearly displaying each possible outcome, percentages, and the consequences of every action. It's still a lot of information, sure, but at least it's visible, accessible, and doesn't rely on memory. Once the player chooses an action, we roll it, show the outcome, and apply its effects. This is where we introduce the buff system, explaining how buffs affect stats, how long they last, and how they consume their turns. Then we get into the first combat encounter. What's implemented here is basically a rough version of what I had before. I didn't go too deep into it because the combat system is going to need a full redesign. I plan to focus completely on that soon, so for now I kept it simple and just moved on. By the way, just a quick note here. Over time I've been integrating more variety into the character visuals by adding a dynamic skin and body morph system. It randomizes body types from slim to muscular to overweight to give each character a bit more personality. The idea is to keep the system consistent across the entire game, but yeah, that's a topic for another devlog. Back to the tutorial. After the combat, we enter a room with loot and explain the different ways to open it, either by forcing it or trying to open it normally. The result here is forced to succeed for the sake of the tutorial flow. We showed that every item has a value and wait for the player to pick up them, locking everything else until he does so to avoid bugs or softlocks. Next up is an NPC room, this time with someone that is willing to trade. This is where we teach how the bartering system works. The NPC might request specific items from the player, or instead, you can offer something and see what the NPC is willing to trade in return, based on the value of that offer. In this case, we're aiming to get a bandage, which we'll need later in a combat scenario when the player receives a bleeding debuff, so the tutorial holds until the bandage is equipped. From that point on, we just loop through a few more forced encounters. The tutorial keeps spawning enemies until the player dies, but in this case I just kill the character directly using the debug panel to move things along. That leads into a placeholder cinematic where the character is dragged into the brainwashing room. Then we saw another placeholder for the actual brainwash process. And in this case, the character loses all his willpower, which means he's fully brainwashed and no longer playable. And that marks the end of the tutorial. The player has completed the basics and now it's time to create his first real character. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and don't forget to add Impious to your wishlist. Cheers and see you in the next video!